Chapter 1. Lex Gray rubbed his eyes and squinted at the road. The snow was thick. He'd almost forgotten what the winters were like this far north. The yellow glow from the street lamps, the muted sound of the car as it drove over packed snow, and the curtains of pine trees made the night, if possible, darker. He shouldn't have left the motel, but when the clock hit 2 a.m. he couldn't take it anymore. He'd sworn to never come back to Warwood. There was nothing here. Surely one of the smallest villages ever placed on a map, and in all fairness most paper maps didn't include it. On a digital one you had to zoom in close. It had one of the smallest grocery stores he'd ever visited, more of a corner store to be honest. There was a one-pump gas station like you see in movies sometimes. A car driving up to the only house on the plain, the house itself about to fold. Outside it, one rusty pump, and inside a rude person with some kind of quirk. Lex was pretty sure every scriptwriter who ever put a scene like it into a manuscript had gotten the idea from Warwood, or not, since it would mean they'd have to know Warwood existed, and he doubted they did. In all honesty, Elsie Burton, who owned the gas station, was a caring, chatty person, old as dirt and nosier than anyone he'd ever met, but she didn't have an evil bone in her body. Lex hadn't gone near the gas station today, and there was no plain, no dusty road where you could see for miles and miles. The pine trees boxed you in, there was no vistas anywhere, unless you got up in the mountains. From there you could see to the end of the world. The river cut through the hills of the forest. Lex hadn't been on a mountain since he left Warwood 17 years ago, but he could still recall the feeling. Did something to a person to stand on a mountain, or to him at least. He connected with the universe. He'd arrived in Warwood a few minutes before the funeral. He didn't want to risk running into anyone before it started. He couldn't stand any condolences, and he wanted to arrive late so he could avoid standing close to his dad. He didn't want anyone to say they were sorry for Nana passing. Most of the people living here were sorry for her passing. He was sure of it. She was well liked by almost everyone, but they could have their grief and allow him to have his. They didn't need to share. They'd never shared anything with him before. He was being unfair. Many of Nana's friends had looked out for him when he was a kid, but no one had been there when he needed them the most. The plan had been for him to stay the night at the Wolfhead Motel, but he couldn't. Warwood held nothing but pain for him, and now that Nana no longer lived, he'd never come back. At 19, when he'd promised never to set foot here again, he'd forgotten she wouldn't live forever. It had never occurred she might die before him. She was the strongest person he'd ever met. He spoke to her almost daily, and despite being over 80, she still came to see him several times a year. He never came to see her. Tears rose in his eyes. He believed he was cried out. He didn't know how long tears silently trickled down his cheeks, but eventually they ran dry. The hum of the car on the snow and the calm of the night lulled him into a state of desolate calm. He had nothing left now. At 19 he'd come out to his dad. How he'd missed Lex being gay was a mystery. Lex had been sure he knew, been convinced he loved him no matter what. He'd been wrong. How couldn't he have suspected, with Cash being with him most of the time? They never kissed in front of his dad, but more than once they'd lounged on the couch and watched a movie or two. Lex draped over Cash playing with his hair or massaging his neck. He could still remember those neck massages. A shiver slid through him. Cash had been 21 then. His hands large and strong, but oh so gentle, and they absently moved in tiny circles over his neck. Cash had been his everything. Growling, he smacked his cheeks. This was not the time to think about Cash. Minutes later, his eyelids were drooping. Yawning, he shook himself and rolled down a window. The frigid air should help wake him, but he yawned again. Fuck. Blinking, the road blurred before his eyes and he rubbed them. How many car crashes had he been to where the driver had fallen asleep behind the wheels? Too many. He fumbled with his phone and connected it to the car stereo. With the windows rolled down and heavy metal loud enough to make the car speakers jump, he reached for his to-go cup with the coffee he'd bought on the way to the funeral but had been unable to drink since his throat had been blocked. The coffee had ice crystals in it. Grimacing, he chunked it down. Caffeine should help him on his quest to reach the south before midday tomorrow, or he guessed it was today. Minutes later, he shivered in the cold, but his vision was still blurred with exhaustion. Shit. He couldn't stop now. He was in the middle of nowhere. Warwood might not warrant a dot on the map, but the stretches between Warwood and civilization were painted as large, forested areas. Pine, pine and more. Pine. Snow, snow and more snow. And a naked man. Lex hit the brakes as hard as he could. The back of the car lifted off the road and he screamed. The man met his gaze and melted into a wolf, but it didn't move off the road. It stood there watching as the back end of his car skewed to the left. The side of the car slid closer to the wolf as if in slow motion, then it all sped up and the forest spun around Lex. He was pressed against the backrest and the seatbelt dug into his skin. Then it all came to a stop. Hissing, he looked around. He was in the ditch next to the road. It wasn't a deep ditch, but he was buried in the snow and didn't think he'd be able to back out of there on his own accord. Fuck. He searched his surroundings but couldn't see any sign of the wolf. At least, he hadn't hit it. Had it been there? He must have dreamed. Maybe there had been a wolf on the road, but no naked men survived in this cold, and men didn't melt into wolves. He didn't think he'd fallen asleep, but he frowned and looked around. His chest hurt where the seatbelt had dug in, but otherwise he was fine. Reaching for the door handle, he looked around again. Was there a wolf outside? A pack of wolves? Slowly, he undid the seatbelt and pushed open the door. The silence was deafening and he hesitated to get out of the car. The warmth wouldn't last long, but outside, he feared he'd freeze to death if the wolves didn't get him. First, there wouldn't be any houses nearby, so walking the road would do no good, but he needed to get hold of a tow truck or something. He walked around the car, his breaths misting around him, and he shivered. His phone had to be somewhere in the car. He'd put it on the passenger seat. As he reached for the door handle, something moved in the periphery and he froze. Slowly, he turned his head to be able to see. Yellow eyes gleamed in the dark between the tree trunks and Lex's lungs ceased to function. A wolf. Fuck. His body didn't move, but his mind raced. What did you do when attacked by wolves? Playing dead was for bears, right? Climb a tree? Wolves couldn't climb. Trees, could they? He breathed in as silently as he could. Don't run, don't fall, don't look them in the eye. He looked away. Never turn your back to them. Those were all tips on what to do when encountering hostile wolves, right? He chanced a glance and the wolf was still there. Another one stepped out on the road. Crap. The speeding thuds of his heart filled his ears. His fingers curled around the cold metal of the handle, and he yanked the door open. Moving as fast as he could, he slipped in on the passenger seat and slammed the door shut. The wolf on the road lowered its head and stalked toward him. Lex hissed and fiddled with the button on the car key. The sound as the lock slid into place made him whimper. Cashew-Dolph woke with a snarl. Someone was outside the cabin. Half a second later, the someone who'd die a slow death pounded on his door. Growling, he flung off the cover and reached for a pair of sweats. He yanked the door open, and when the scent of pack reached him, he growled. Cash. Samus shouldn't be out running in the middle of the night. He was a low-ranking wolf who could easily be attacked if he was on his own. Though, who'd attack him on Packland, Cash didn't know. What? Samus winced. There. Cash took a deep breath to clear his sleepy head. Samus smelled of fear. Wasn't unusual. The young wolves in the pack feared him. The older ones did too, but they'd learned to control it better. Yes. He tried to keep the growl out of his voice. Samus was a good man. He didn't know him well, but he brought out Cash's softer side. He didn't let it show. Always did his best not to form any closer connections in the pack. He was the enforcer. When he'd been younger, he'd believed he could combine being a pack enforcer with a normal life, but he'd quickly realized his mistake. His father had always lived more like a lone wolf than part of the pack. Cash had hated it. He wanted the companionship, wanted the closeness all the others had, but after he'd had to kill Rosa Hemming, who'd fed him cinnamon rolls as a pup, he understood his father's decision. It was hard to kill a pack member. Harder still to kill a friend. Gordon. There was a car and he ice-filled Cash's veins. It had happened once before that he'd been called out to kill a wolf who'd been too badly hurt even for the sped-up healing of a werewolf. How bad off is he? Oh no, he's fine. It's the human. The car spun and while Gordon wants to kill him before he can tell someone. Jenna said no, but Gordon didn't want to listen and Samus rubbed his forehead. I thought it best if you came. Cash nodded. Did Eric send you? Eric was their alpha. If he ordered Cash to kill the human, he'd have to kill the human. To this day, Cash had never killed a human, and he didn't want to ever. Humans lived under different rules. Humans were glorious. His mate was human, though he'd abandoned him. Wincing, he turned to locate his boots. He stepped into them barefoot. Hopefully it wasn't too far away. No, I ran when Gordon and Jenna argued about killing the human or not. We don't kill humans even if they see us shift, do we? The pleading tone made Cash look at him again. Do you know the human? A few of the humans in Warwood knew of their existence, and there were many tall tales, most of them true, but the humans didn't know. At least not the younger generation. No. He shook his head. It's only, he grimaced. It wasn't his fault, and he didn't hurt anyone, and he looked sad. Samus sucked in a breath. And Gordon is an ass. Cash hid a smile. Samus had one of the gentler souls in the pack, and it wouldn't surprise Cash if he became a healer or a teacher or something along those lines. Right now, he worked part-time in the library in Riverside Grove, but it was too far to drive to keep up in the long run. He helped Eric out, too. Gordon wasn't alpha material, but he believed he was. He was dominant, but he didn't have any sense. Luckily, Eric was still strong enough to wipe the floor with anyone challenging him. Cash was as dominant as Eric, and he might be physically stronger, but there was no animosity between them. Being pack enforcer was the only hereditary title in the pack, so it didn't matter if Cash was dominant, strong, big, vicious, or whatever else people might describe him as. He could never be alpha, and he didn't want to be. He was outside pack order, much like an omega would be. The pack didn't have an omega. He looked at Samus again, not an omega, but there wasn't much dominance in him. Cash's heart melted, and he cursed himself. Protectiveness welled up inside of him. Samus reminded him of Lex. His Lex. Lex, who'd he abandoned when he'd needed Cash the most. Had Lex been a wolf, Cash didn't think he'd be an omega. He didn't shy away the way Samus did, but then again, Samus was a submissive wolf. Lex wasn't submissive. He wasn't dominant in the way a dominant wolf was, but he was strong. He collected people's pains and sorrows from them, Cash's included. Lex allowed him to dream, to want, to be happy. With Lex he could be more than the pack enforcer. He could be himself. He shook his head and focused on the now. Is it far? If Gordon had killed the human before either Cash or Eric made the decision, Cash would have to punish him. He might agree with Samus. Gordon was an ass. But he was tired of scrubbing blood stains off his clothes. Through the woods. It's on the road toward Riverside Grove. Not far. Cash grabbed his jacket. He didn't have a shirt, but his jacket was warm, and if he needed to, he could always shift into a wolf. Lead the way. Chapter 2. Lex's breaths created clouds around him. How come the car got cold within seconds in the winter but stayed boiling hot for ages in the summer? He studied the wolves with a growing sense of trepidation. The screen on his phone was shattered, and while there was some light, he couldn't see anything on the screen, and it didn't react to spoken commands. The dark was still thick around him, but the wolves were visible in the yellow light from the street lamps. Lex was no expert on wolves, far from, but he believed these ones acted a bit weird. Granted, he'd never studied a pack of wolves. He'd always been a little afraid of dogs. They tended to walk all over him. He needed to show them who was alpha, Nana had told him, but it was clearly the dogs who were the alphas. Every single one he met. One large gray wolf kept stepping closer to the car, but every time it did, smaller, darker wolf blocked its path and showed teeth. Part of Lex wanted to run out there and tell them not to fight. He hated fights, but he feared they'd all turn on him if he did. A huge, mostly white wolf trotted out on the road, and Lex swallowed a yelp. He'd believed the ones present to this moment had been scary, but this one forced himself to take a deep breath. It was huge, and the others shied away as it walked past them. Holy hell! Could wolves be that big, or was he dreaming again? He heard the growl through the car. Shit! The white wolf turned and looked at Lex, looked him right in the eye, and Lex dropped his gaze. He wasn't good with eye contact under normal circumstances, not unless he was working, and meeting a predator's gaze wasn't high on his list. A howl cut through the night, and Lex shivered. In an instant, the wolves melted into the woods. The white wolf stayed the longest. It took a step closer to the car, but then turned to slowly walk into The woods. Lex blew out a breath only to scream again. Out from between the tree trunks stepped a hulking man. On his shoulder rested a spade, not a snow shovel, as someone who wanted to be a good fellow human and dig a stranger out of the snow might have brought. No, a rusty old garden spade. Or it might not be rusty, but it was a tool fit for burying a body. Though the ground would be frozen, would it not? Maybe not. It was only November, and the snow insulated against the cold. Perhaps it was still possible to bury a body. If he shoveled snow over it, no one would be the wiser. There was a knock on the window. Lex yelped. Then the man bent and looked at him through the window, and Lex's heart stopped. Cash. It might have been 17 years, but he was almost certain it was Cash. The stunned look on his face confirmed Lex's suspicion, and he rolled down the window. Cash. They'd planned to run away together. They'd talked about it several times, and when Lex had called him after his father had given him 1 hour to get out of the house, they were to meet by Elsie's gas station. Lex had waited, a backpack slung over his shoulder and his eyes as red and swollen as they were now. He had waited and waited and waited, but Cash had never shown. After hours had gone by, Nana had come to get him. He suspected Elsie had called her. They'd been close friends. Elsie had been to the funeral, but Lex had snuck away before she got a chance to talk to him. He knew she wanted to talk to him, but he couldn't face her. The day after, he'd called Cash only to get his father. There were no cell phones back then. Cash's father had informed him Cash had left town without Lex. Lex. It came out as a sigh, and Lex winced. Fuck. For all the heartache and silly dreams, he'd hoped he'd never see Cash again. And if he was to see him, he'd hoped it wouldn't be on the day he'd buried Nana or right after he'd had a car crash and almost gotten eaten by wolves. Are you okay? Cash sounded shaken. Lex couldn't blame him. Fine. You don't happen to have a phone, do you? Cash frowned, then patted his pockets only to scowl. Back home. He motioned in the direction he'd come through the woods. Great. Are you hurt? Nope. I'm fine. Could you call a tow truck for me? Cash hesitated. Lex. Do you live far from here? No, it's through the. Great, could you hurry? I assume it'll take them some time to get here. Lex, it's in the middle. I'm sure there is some company in the vicinity that's open around the clock. Cash frowned at him. You're back in Warwood? No. Could you go call? Cash didn't move. Please. It came out as a whisper, and Lex cursed his eyes for burning again. He was out of tears, and he'd promised himself if he ever saw Cash again, he'd be cool, suave, and hopefully successful. He didn't know if being an EMT could be called being successful, but he was good at what he did, and he loved his job, stress and all. Come with me. No, I'm fine here. You go. It was freezing cold, but he couldn't go with Cash. It wasn't an option. Cash didn't know what to do. Lex was here. His Lex. Right here. 17 years and not a day had gone by without Cash thinking about him. A distant howl reminded him there was a world outside the bubble he and Lex were in. He looked at him again. He'd aged, of course he had. His eyes were the same. He had hints of crow's feet at the corners, but it only made him more beautiful. There was a scar by his right eyebrow that hadn't been there when Cash last saw him, and pain sliced through him. He hadn't been there when it happened. His dark hair was short on the sides and a little longer on the top. His lower lip was still a lot plumper than his upper. Cash had always wanted to bite it, and that hadn't changed. His gaze lingered, then he heaved a sigh. Was the stubble on his cheeks enough to hide the dimples? Lex hadn't smiled, so he couldn't tell. Lex had always been quick to smile. No matter what shit had gone down, Lex had been able to spare a smile for the people around him. Had he lost the ability? Had Cash stolen it from him? Had his father? Cash had wanted to rip Lex's father to shreds. He'd called. Soon after Lex had called, Lex's father had too. He'd wanted to speak to Cash's dad. He'd heard snippets of the conversation. Lex's father had apologized if his son had contaminated Cash. Cash had snorted. His dad had too, so he'd believed they were cool. The call ended, and Cash's dad had turned to him and informed him he could suck as much cock as he wanted as long as he never touched a human ever again, and made sure there was an heir to take over after Cash was gone. They'd fought. A real physical fight, and Cash had won. He hadn't wanted to win. He'd been angry. Lex was the most beautiful creature who ever set foot on this earth. And he'd allowed Cash to touch him, to hold him, to kiss him. He didn't care. If he was human. He was Cash's. Besting his father in a fight changed more than he'd wanted it to. It meant he was the pack enforcer. It didn't matter if he'd challenged his father over Lex, he'd won the challenge, which meant he'd succeeded him. He'd run. After having spent 10 days running around in wolf form, he'd returned to the pack. He was the pack enforcer. No one had any say in his personal life as long as he did his job. He'd mate Lex, would bring him into the pack, and if someone had any objections, he'd show them who was the strongest. Only when he'd come back, Lex was gone. What are you waiting for? Cash jumped at Lex's voice. I think you should come with me. It'll be hours before a tow truck gets here. Cash wasn't sure he wanted to call one. And you'll turn into a popsicle. No, I'll wait here. Lex. No, Cash. The desperation in his voice broke Cash's heart. He grabbed the door handle, but it was locked. Come on, unlock the door and come with me. I'll make you a cup of tea while we wait. It's in the middle of the night. Yes. What are you doing out driving at this hour? Lex looked away. I couldn't sleep, so I figured I might as well drive home. Home. Cash's soul ached with the word. Lex's home was with him. Didn't he? No. Been to see. Who did he have left? Your Nan. Because he hadn't patched things up with his father, had he? Cash hoped not. The man deserved to die a bitter, lonely man. Lex gave one short nod. His eyes focused on the trees to his left. Won't she be worried when she wakes and finds you gone? Had he been to see her often? Cash stayed away from the village as much as he could. He only went there when he needed to buy groceries, and he made sure his freezer was filled to the brim to avoid having to stand in the middle of Warwood and remember. How many times had Lex been nearby, and he'd missed him? He'd searched for him when he'd come back, but he was nowhere to be found. Back then, social media wasn't as widespread, but it hadn't mattered. Cash had been sure he could find him. Lex was an unusual name, and while Ward was a common last name, he'd been sure he could find him. He'd been convinced he'd be able to pin him down. He never did, and after a few months he stopped searching. It was obvious Lex didn't want to be found. No. His voice hitched, but he cleared his throat. She won't worry. Cash found that hard to believe. Sylvie would walk through fire for Lex, even if her asshole son wouldn't. Had Cash been the age and in the position he was now when he'd kicked Lex out, he'd have killed Kenneth Ward. Laws be damned. He'd hurt Lex, had made him cry. Cash would never forget how he'd sounded on the phone. Sylvie had been there, though. Elsie had told him Sylvie had taken Lex home. And if she woke to find his bed empty, she'd leave no stone unturned until she found him. He didn't know how many times he'd been on his way to talk to Sylvie to ask where Lex was, but had he wanted to see Cash, he'd contacted him. Are you sure? Lex nodded. Come on now. He motioned at the door. We'll head home and call a tow truck. Or not. His car could stay there and rust for all Cash cared. All he wanted was to get Lex over the threshold of his cabin. He wasn't sure he'd ever let him go once he was. Chapter 3. Lex relented. He couldn't feel his feet anymore, and the cold had crept into his bones. If he stayed in the car much longer, he'd turn into an ice cube. He pushed open the door, forced Cash to move out of the way, and stepped out. Lex wasn't short, but he had nothing on Cash. It wasn't only the height. It was his bulk, and the energy around him that always made Lex feel dainty. It had never bothered him. The opposite rather, for he could relax around Cash as if he'd protect him from all evil. This was before he broke his heart. Lex had never recovered. He didn't sit alone in his apartment and pine, but he'd never allowed anyone to get under his skin the way he'd allowed Cash. He'd never fallen as deeply, never again loved without caution. He'd never loved at all. He'd had partners, boyfriends, and he'd been engaged once, though seeing his fiancée make out with his closest colleague in the parking lot in broad daylight had put an end to the relationship. Lex hadn't mourned the loss, which should have told him something. He'd been infatuated a few times, but he'd never fully given himself to anyone. After Cash, the last few years, Lex had concluded he was better off on his own. He and his Fat, lazy tabby cat Mr. M lived a great life. He worked, and when he got home, they cuddled in front of the TV. Things could be worse. Aren't you afraid of the wolves? Lex scanned the woods. They'd go in there? The wolves might have scattered when they heard Cash approach, but he'd seen the way they'd measured Lex. It hadn't been to fit him for a coffin, more like how much seasoning they'd need when they put him on the grill rack. Cash froze. The wolves. Yeah, there was a pack of wolves. They ran off right before you approached. It was how I ended up in the ditch. I was driving, and all of a sudden there was a wolf on the road. He didn't mention there being a naked man. It had to have been a dream. I hit the brakes because it wouldn't move, and the car spun. Cash looked him up and down. Did it roll? Lex frowned. No, it stood there staring at me. Poor thing must have been terrified, but then it looked like it wanted to eat me, so I hopped back into the car. The car, did you spin or? He indicated the car rolling around with his fingers. Oh, spun a lap or two. No biggie. It would have been fine had I not ended up in the ditch. Cash growled, an honest-to-God growl. Maybe he'd lived out here with the wolves a bit too long. Why are you carrying a spade? Maybe he should have led with that. He might think he knew Cash. His gut told him he could trust him despite his heart's objections, but what if he'd turned into a murderer and only had lured Lex out of the car so he could bury him? Heard you slide off the road and figured I might have to dig you out. You heard me slide off the road? Lex put as much disbelief into the question as he could. Not only had it taken Cash a long time to show up, but there was no way he could have heard him slide off the road. The snow softened the sounds, and it hadn't been a violent collision. Cash frowned at him. Come on. But Lex shook his head. It was a clear lie. Lex had always been good at telling when someone lied. It was in the air around them, and it was why Cash leaving him had hurt so much. He hadn't been prepared, hadn't seen it coming. He'd been young and naive and hadn't been looking for signs of betrayal. Same with his dad. He hadn't had a clue he was a homophobe, though. How he'd missed it was a mystery. Lex had learned a lot that day. It had always only been his dad and him. His mother had left them before he'd turned one, and he had no idea where she was, if she lived at all. He'd believed the bond he and his dad had was unbreakable. It was the two of them against the world. Sure, his dad could say some prejudiced things sometimes, but he'd never believed, not for a second, he'd say the same things to Lex. He should have, though. There had been signs he should have considered. There had been a gnawing worry in his belly, but he'd ignored it and had told his dad Cash was more than his friend. He was his boyfriend. He trusted his gut feeling more these days, listened to it all the time. Came in handy in his job. He could often sense how badly hurt someone was and could help them through it. He couldn't explain it, but him being there made a difference to them, and it gave him a high to know he helped. He wanted to help. What do you mean, You're lying to me. I know we haven't spoken in 17 years, but I can still tell when you're lying. Cash grinned, and Lex's gut tightened. Damn. Samus came to knock on my door. Said someone had an accident on the road, so I brought a spade. And how did Samus know? And why didn't Samus come to check on me? Cash met his gaze. The wolves. You acted as if you didn't know about the wolves. Right then a howl cut through the night, and Lex shivered. There are wolves here, but they'd never hurt me. Samus knows, so he came to get me. Lex wanted to accuse him of lying, but come on. He nodded toward the forest. A cup of tea, a phone call, and you can tell me all about what you're doing these days. He inhaled deeply. You're not seeing anyone. It wasn't a question, more a statement, and something predatory gleamed in Cash's eyes. Lex's pulse sped up despite trying to keep calm. I was engaged. Why, he told him he didn't know. It wasn't a lie, but it was years ago. He didn't want Cash to think he'd been alone. He growled again, and Lex frowned at him. He'd never growled before. Times in bed, but Lex had loved the sounds he'd made then, as if he couldn't help himself, as if he tried to be quiet, tried to be in control, but couldn't. Not what he needed to be thinking of now. But you broke up? Yeah. It's me and Mr. M now. We're great together. Cash narrowed his eyes but trudged into the woods. But he's not with you. Here. No, Jamie is looking after him. Cash pressed his lips together into a thin line. Lex shouldn't enjoy it, but he did. Jamie. Yeah. Mentally he chuckled. Only reason Cash would turn Jamie into a question was because he wanted to know more. Lex wasn't giving him more. Cash breathed in through his nose. And Jamie has been in your life a long time. Lex watched the ground to avoid tripping over anything in the snow. I think it's 7 years now, so yeah, a long time. And they're waiting for you back home? They're most likely sleeping right now. Cash snorted, and Lex was pleased with himself for having given nothing away. Together? Jamie and Mr. M. It's likely. Mr. M likes to have someone in our bed if I'm not there. What the fuck, Lex? It was hard not to laugh, but Lex gave him a blank stare. Is it far? My shoes are not meant for this kind of terrain. He wore sneakers which might not have been the best choice in this weather, but he hadn't planned on getting out of the car. Cash looked down, but Lex's feet were buried in the snow, so he wouldn't be able to see much. Cash was hanging on to his control by a bare thread. Who the hell was Jamie? Who was Mr. M? When Lex stepped out of the car, he'd been sure he wasn't with anyone. He had no other sense clinging to him, but humans didn't mate as shifters did, and sense would fade when apart. Not all shifters exchanged mate bites. The mating wasn't in the bite. You had one mate, and that person was your mate whether you bit them or not. Without a bite, sense dissipated over time. How long had Lex been in Warwood? And was he in a poly relationship? Cash couldn't do poly. He wanted to slaughter anyone who'd touched Lex through the years. He couldn't share. Lex was his. Only his. This time Cash would mate him, and he'd never let him out of his sight ever again. There would be no fiancés, no Jamies, and no Mr. MS. What kind of person called themselves Mr. M? Was it some role play or BDSM shit? Cash didn't do those things either. A branch snapped under Lex's foot, and he swayed. Cash grabbed his elbow to prevent him from falling. Thanks. Lex shook free of his hold. It's not much longer. He gestured at the light streaming through the tree trunks. He'd left the door lamp on. This is taking secluded to a new level. Cash smiled. He loved his cabin. It wasn't visible from any road, and unless you knew where to turn, and it was next to impossible to get there by car. You sure you haven't turned into an axe murderer over the years? The look of trepidation on Lex's face had Cash stopping. Was he afraid of him? It hurt. More than it should. Everyone was afraid of him, but Lex had never been. Before. I'm sure. I bet all axe murderers say that. He pursed his lips and looked ahead as he walked. He should be able to glimpse the cabin through the trees. You'd be surprised by what people are capable of. His attention was on the cabin, not on Cash. He took the opportunity to look at him. Still so goddamn beautiful it made his hands long to touch, but there was something. He looked tired, lost, and it made Cash ache. He should have been there for Lex to lean on. It's lovely, Cash. For the first time Lex smiled at him. It had a lump forming in his throat. Stubble or not, the dimples were there. I like it. Cash's voice had gone husky, and Lex raised an eyebrow at him. Had it been 17 years ago, he'd have pushed him against a tree and kissed him. I can imagine. He took a step forward, the serious expression back in place, leaving Cash bereft. He hurried past him and up the stairs. Come on. T. He held the door open, forcing Lex to move closer to him. Something warm would be lovely. Cash could warm him. They stepped inside, and Cash closed the door behind them. He hoped Eric had the situation with Gordon under control. Cash didn't want to be interrupted, and he didn't want to leave his cabin ever again, at least not for as long as Lex stayed. Kitchen is this way. Not like he could get lost. The cabin only had a kitchen, a living room, and a bedroom. There was some storage space and a bathroom, but it wasn't big enough to wander. Can I borrow your phone? Cash froze. Yeah, of course. He went to the bedroom where he'd left the phone on the bedside table. Here you go. He unlocked it and handed it to Lex. Lex followed him into the kitchen while reading on the screen. Cash glanced at him, but he was too engrossed in his search for a tow truck to notice. Lex fit in his kitchen. He pulled out a chair and sank down on it. There are no tow trucks nearby. Cash shrugged. They were in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it's easier to call one of the mechanics. I don't think the car's broken, just stuck. I only need someone to pull me out. Then Lex looked at him with narrowed eyes. Don't you have a car? He did, but for once luck was on his side. I do, but it's in the shop. I'm to get it this afternoon. Your car is in the shop? Disbelief widened his eyes. Yes, you're free to check my garage if you don't believe me. No. He shook his head. I believe you. I'm to go into Warwood with Eric after lunch. I can pull you out after. Or this Eric person could pull me out before. Cash was about to object, but he didn't have a plausible excuse. We can call him in the morning. Lex's eyes flew to his. Yeah, right, it's the middle of the night. Thank heavens, or Lex would be out of here in no time. Still want tea, or do you want to go to bed? Cash. The way he said it could mean a lot of things. I'm not going to sleep with you. I only have one bed, but it's a double, so I think you'd survive it. Cash. Might not. Indecision stole over Lex's face. Come on, babe, you need to rest. You look exhausted. Lex turned a steely gaze his way. Do not call me babe. Oops. Lex. He nodded. You need to rest, especially if you're going to drive later today. You shouldn't drive when tired. Lex hated it when Cash was right. He'd been too tired to drive. He'd fallen asleep behind the wheel, had seen a naked man turn into a wolf, and then almost been eaten by wolves, for fuck's sake. He should sleep, but he didn't think he could. Nana was gone. He was in fucking Warwood, in Cash's house. His body wanted to relax, his gut telling him he'd finally come home, but he hadn't. This wasn't his home, and Cash wasn't his. It was an echo of an old life, a pulse bringing oxygen to an old dream. And he was cold, so cold. The thought of crawling into bed with Cash filled him with longing, but giving in would have consequences. Leaving would be like ripping his heart out again. Had everything been well, he might have been able to handle seeing Cash. Maybe, but this was one of the worst days in his life. He was tired and lonely, lost and grieving. Let's go to bed. A knot formed in Lex's belly. It would be easy to give in, to allow Cash to take over, but he'd have to pay the price in the morning. I don't know. Cash. Sleep. We'll get some rest, and once the sun is up we can deal with the car. Lex nodded. He couldn't demand Cash call his friends in the middle of the night to pull his car out of a ditch. He sighed, stood, and held the phone out to Cash. You're sure you didn't hurt yourself? Cash took the phone in one hand and gently squeezed his shoulder with the other. Lex shook his head. No, the seatbelt yanked me back, but I wasn't driving fast and I hit the brakes. The hand on his shoulder burned, and for a second, Lex leaned into the touch. Then he came to his senses and stepped away. Cash reached for him but stopped himself and allowed Lex to put distance between them. Bathrooms in there. He pointed at a door visible from the kitchen and the bedroom. He gestured at the open door from where he'd gotten the phone. The awkward tension made Lex escape into the bathroom. He used the facilities, then spent a few minutes staring at himself in the mirror. He looked terrible. His eyes were puffy and red-rimmed, his face pale, and exhaustion made him look 10 years older than he normally did. It didn't matter. He wasn't here to impress Cash, and yet he wished he'd looked better. When he walked out, Cash was leaning against the bedroom doorjamb with his arms crossed over his chest. Who's Jamie? Huh. You said Mr. M is with Jamie. Who's Jamie? Lex sighed. It's none of your business, Cash. He was too tired to think. Nothing about my life is your business anymore. He most likely imagined it, but it looked like Cash's eyes changed color. Maybe he was dreaming again. Which side is yours? He pushed past Cash and crossed the threshold. The bedroom wasn't big, but it was cozy. Earth tones. Lex's shoulders dropped as he took in the bed in the warm glow of the bedside lamp. Doesn't matter. Crawl in. I'll take a shower. His tone was growly, but Lex didn't care. He could be as pissed as he wanted. Lex had to protect his heart. And the easiest way to do it was to not let Cash in, not one little bit. As soon as he offered up information, more would follow. He'd always had a silly urge to share everything with Cash. Lex stepped out of his socks and jeans but kept his underwear and t-shirt on. His jeans were wet from the knees down. His socks were wet as well, and his feet burned from cold. Shivers rocked his body, but he slid in under the covers and breathed in deep. It smelled of Cash. A lump formed in his throat. For years he dreamed about his scent. He had it mostly under control these days, but it was the strangest thing. No one else's scent had nestled itself into his subconscious. He couldn't describe it. It wasn't as easy as saying he smelled of Bleu de Chanel or sandalwood or whatever else was a common scent. He smelled of cash. He smelled of home, of safety, of belonging. Only he didn't. He smelled of betrayal and a broken heart. Too bad his brain never got the memo. The sound of the shower was cut off, and soon after, Cash walked into the room. Lex closed his eyes and feigned sleep. When the bed dipped, he forgot to breathe. Are you okay? Damn. Splendid. Cash chuckled, and then there was a snick as he turned off the lamp. Try to get some rest. We'll call Eric in the morning, or maybe Samus. Someone will be able to help. Lex kept his eyes closed but nodded. Chapter 4. Cash was a creep. He waited until Lex had fallen asleep. Took far longer than it should have, considering the time of day. Then he moved closer, buried his nose in the crook of Lex's neck, careful not to wake him, and inhaled his heart, his soul, his life, his Lex. Slowly, he turned over on his back and nudged Lex closer. He whimpered. Nightmare? It sounded like a nightmare, not strange since he'd been in a car crash. Shoo. He ran his thumb over his neck in a circle as he'd always done when they'd been together. Lex melted against him, his breaths evening out. Cash relaxed with him. This was how they were supposed to be, always. Lex was sleeping draped over him, where he belonged. Sometime later, Cash woke to a distressed sound. His initial response was to fling himself out of bed and deal with it, only it came from the bed. Lex was crying. Cash stilled. A tear trickled down Lex's cheek, and Cash pressed his lips together not to whine. Lex. He gently shook him. Lex, honey, you're dreaming. Lex stiffened against him, his eyes snapping open, and he looked around. Then he tilted his head back and looked up at Cash. He wouldn't be able to make out his facial expression. Cash remembered how crappy Lex's night vision was, but he smiled anyway. He shouldn't have. Lex's face crumbled and new tears spilled from his eyes. Oh, babe. Cash hugged him close. Was it that bad? He should have woken him earlier. Lex shook his head. It wasn't. Then why are you crying? Fear gripped him. Are you hurt? We should have gone to the hospital. Humans are fragile. Is it your neck? Your back? Cash looked around. He'd have to call someone. Samus. Samus would drive them to the hospital. Lex needed x-rays, and what if he had a concussion? Cash had taken him to bed instead of making sure he was okay. He was a terrible mate. I'm not hurt. Are you sure? I think we need to go. You cried in your sleep. You're in pain. I'm fine. Cash grabbed his shoulder gently. Honey, you're not fine. You're crying. It was the dream. Cash sighed, tried to relax into the mattress, and carefully gathered Lex in his arms. What was it about? He wasn't sure he believed the tears were because of the dream, but if Lex could tell him what it was about, then maybe. Nothing special. Nana making me breakfast. Do you want me to call her and let her know you're here? Maybe sneaking out in the middle of the night had caused him to dream. Lex sniveled and wiped his eyes. No, she's not there. Cash was quiet. She's not there? You were here to see her? Lex nodded. Her funeral was today. Pain stabbed at Cash. Fuck, babe. I'm so sorry. He hugged him tighter as his eyes burned. He hadn't been there when Lex lost the only person who'd ever truly cared about him. I'm so sorry. I would have come had I known. Why? She was nothing to you. Not true. Lex made a noise. She loved you, so I loved her. You deserve to have 20 Sylvie Wards in your life, but you only had one. Gray. What? Her last name wasn't Ward. She was Gray. Cash frowned at the dark ceiling. I was sure she was Ward. Your dad is Ward. You're Ward. Gray. I'm Lex Gray. Cash sucked in a breath. He spent months looking for Lex Ward. But your name was Lex Ward. It was. We changed it. What? How had he not known? The whole village would have been talking about it. When? Lex winced. Back then. She picked me up at the gas station and cursed all wards to hell. I reminded her she was a ward too, and she suggested we'd break free. Gray was her maiden name. And you changed it, the two of you? No one had told him. Few knew he'd been searching for Lex, but someone should have told him. Yeah. I looked for you. Lex stopped breathing. You did. When I came back, I looked for you. You'd left town and I searched, but I searched for Lex Ward. Where did you go? When you left town, I mean. Cash shook his head. I didn't leave. Your dad told me you'd left town. Cash hummed. I was in the woods, clearing my head, making decisions, accepting my fate. But when I came back, you were gone. Accepting your fate? Lex's tone was disbelieving. It's hard to explain. I fought my dad. He had no problem with me being gay as long as I promised to have a kid to carry on the family name. He winced at the lie. It wasn't about the name, it was about the position in the pack. Cash didn't care. When he was gone, the pack would have to find someone else. Because unless Lex took him back and wanted to adopt a child, he wouldn't have a kid. But he forbade me to see you again. I snapped and hit him. You hit him? Like hit? Your father? Yeah. He hit me back and soon there was a full-on brawl. I won, but I never wanted to fight my dad, and I didn't know what to do after. I was scared and I ran. He'd been terrified, but he'd never told anyone. He had never wanted to be the pack enforcer, disciplining, punishing, executing. He'd never wanted to be the one to do it. It was part of being a werewolf. He and Eric were the legal system of the pack, but he'd never wanted it, and especially not at the age of 21. Lex didn't speak, and neither did Cash. He wasn't sure what to say. I'm sorry. About Sylvie, Lex. So damn sorry. Lex nodded. I swore to never come back here, and I haven't. I haven't set foot in Warwood for 17 years, but I never counted on her dying. What about her house? Lex frowned. What about it? Who inherits it? She had some land. It didn't border on pack land, but it wasn't far from. Cash had strolled through her woods several times. Dad, I assume. You sure? If she changed her name to not have the same as him, do you think she'd leave her house to him? Lex sighed. He's still her son. And I don't want it. You don't? It's a lovely house and the forest is. He quieted. Lex didn't give a damn about the forest right now. Would be a shame if Kenneth got it. I don't want to live in Warwood. If he wants it, he can have it. Pain stabbed Cash's heart. Why don't you want to live in Warwood? He had to live in Warwood. Cash couldn't move. He was the pack enforcer. There is nothing for me here. I'm here. Lex snorted. Then the snort bled into a chuckle. Cash, we haven't spoken for 17 years. But you're mine. Didn't he know? I'm my own, and if it hadn't been for a freaking wolf refusing to get off the road, we never would have met again. Cash wanted to throttle Gordon for making Lex have an accident, but he couldn't help but be grateful for his reckless behavior, though they hadn't addressed the whole Lex seeing him shift part. Lex hadn't mentioned it, and Cash didn't know if he should bring it up, how to bring it up. I'm yours then. Lex shook his head. We're not the same people we were. You have a life, I have a life. With Jamie and Mr. M? Lex grinned at him, though his gaze was a little off, telling him he didn't see him well. It didn't matter. He was grinning. Yeah, a life with Jamie and Mr. M, who are together in bed right now. Probably. And you're okay with them being together when you're not there? Could Cash allow him to keep them if they made him happy? No. He didn't share, couldn't share. Lex was his and his alone. Well, Mr. M is his own master. I'm his human. And Jamie. Wait, what? He's a shifter. Did Lex already know? Could it be why he hadn't said anything about seeing Gordon shift? He was already living with a shifter. Cash inhaled deeply. He couldn't catch any scent, but if they weren't mated, the scent would fade when Lex was away from him. Shifter. Lex laughed. He's a cat, stupid. Cash's mouth dropped open. A cat, not a shifter. And Lex was his human. Scowling, he glared at Lex. Funny. Lex laughed more. A little. He turned over so he was on his back. Cash wanted to pull him back into his embrace, but at least Lex's head was still resting on his biceps. Jamie is cat-sitting. We worked together, and after having brought Mr. M to her place a few times and having him try to escape as soon as the door opens, she figured it was easier if she stayed in my apartment. It's not often I have to go places, so he shrugged. And your apartment is where? Cottleway. Cash nodded. Cottleway was at least a 7-hour drive south. You went far. If you're gonna run, you better do it properly. I guess. Cash caught a strand of Lex's hair between his fingers. Are you happy there? Could he let Lex go, knowing he was happy somewhere without him? Lex nodded. I like my job. Cash stilled. Liked his job? It was not the same as being happy, was it? Lex. He turned to his side. Maybe we should get up? Dawn will be here soon, right? He rolled away and Cash cursed mentally. Lex's heart was racing. He'd wanted to slide his arm around Cash, snuggle closer, lose himself in his warmth. But it was a bad idea. He had to get out of here, had to leave Warwood. He reached for his jeans, but they were still wet. You don't happen to have some clothes I can borrow? He'd drown in Cash's clothes, but it beat putting on wet ones. My jeans and socks are wet. Cash moved soundlessly in the dark, and soon he was crouching on the floor in front of Lex. I can dress myself. I know. And yet he pushed at Lex until he sat on the bed and put thick, fluffy socks on his feet. Coffee. He handed Lex what he believed was a pair of sweats. Please. As he got up, he leaned forward and kissed Lex's forehead. The move stunned Lex, and he stared as Cash left the room. A light came on in the kitchen and the soft glow spilled in through the bedroom door. Pulling the two big sweats on, he ventured out. It was still pitch black outside. The white snow shone in the moonlight. Tranquil. In Cottleway there were always noises, lights shining and cars driving. Here silence ruled. The coffee maker made its first sound of the day, and Lex looked over at Cash. He wasn't handsome, big and strong, but not classically handsome. Rugged more so now than he'd been at 21, but there was something. He had something no one else had, something that spoke to Lex on a deeper level. Cash was the one he compared everyone else to, and no one ever measured up. Cash smiled. What? Nothing. Lex shook himself. God damn it. He was losing his mind. Cash didn't push, instead he watched the coffee maker. When enough for two half cups had dripped down, Cash divided the coffee between them before putting the pot back in its place. Milk and 2 sugars? Only milk these days. Cash looked at him over his shoulder. Finally realized you're sweet enough as you are. He winked, and a pang of longing hit Lex. Cash had always told him he was sweet enough without the sugar in the coffee. Such a silly, sappy thing, and yet it had a lump forming in his throat. Yeah, and health issues. You're sick. The serious expression almost made Lex want to poke fun at him. But he didn't have the energy. Not to my knowledge, but sugar isn't good for you, and I work weird hours, so coffee keeps me afloat. It amounted to a lot of sugar in a day. Cash nodded. What do you do? I'm an EMT. Oh. Cash frowned. You drive an ambulance? Jamie most often drives, but sure, sometimes. So you're a nurse? Lex shrugged. I bet you're great at what you do. Instead of answering, Lex took a sip of the coffee Cash handed him. He'd always wanted to do something where he helped people, and now he did. What do you do? Cash grimaced. It's hard to explain. Hard to explain? Cash groaned and put his cup on the kitchen table while running his free hand through his hair. He was nervous. It made Lex stand straighter. What the hell could make him nervous about his job? The wolf. Was there something different about it? Lex stared at him. The wolf? I don't know enough about wolves to be able to tell. It was big, but not as big as the white one that came after. Cash nodded. Nothing else? The shape of it. The shape? The naked man? Had Lex been talking in his sleep? He took a careful breath and looked at Cash. I was tired. I'm pretty sure I fell asleep behind the wheel, and when I looked up, it was there. But before it was a wolf, it was a dream. Cash smiled, but it was a weird smile. A man. A naked man in the middle of fucking nowhere. And it's freezing cold. Lex shook his head. It wasn't real, Cash. And what if it was? Lex frowned at him. Cash wasn't normally one to make fun of people, but maybe it had changed since Lex had known him. People don't change shape. Unless they're shifters. Yeah, but we established Mr. M is a cat. Gordon isn't. Something steely crept into Cash's eyes, and a shiver slid down Lex's spine. My job is to make sure he doesn't shift shape in front of humans again. Don't get me wrong. I'm glad it was you in the car, but he knows better. Lex shook his head. Cash was crazy. Samus came running because Gordon wanted to kill you. If he'd killed you. The look in Cash's eyes made it impossible to breathe, and Lex took a step back. Fear sent icy tendrils through his body, and he glanced toward the hallway. He couldn't run. Where would he run? I would have skinned him alive, Lex. He doesn't know what you mean to me, no? One does other than Dad and Eric, but while I'm sure Eric knows you're here now, he doesn't know you're my Lex. Lex's back hit the wall. Shit. Don't be afraid, babe. Nothing and no one will ever touch you, but my job is to make sure idiots like Gordon don't kill innocent people. Maybe Lex was dreaming now. It had been an exhausting day and maybe he believed he was awake when he was in the motel sleeping. Cash moved closer, and Lex pressed more firmly against the wall. He'd slept in Cash's bed without knowing he was insane. As he stepped closer, his eyes changed color. Don't fear me, Lex. Easy for you to say. Groaning, Cash closed the distance between them. If you understood what you are to me, you'd never fear me. And what am I to you? You're mine. My mate. My one and only. Lex would wake up soon. Any second now. Cash dipped his head and brushed his lips against Lex's. It was chaste and sweet, and it left Lex trembling, but he wasn't sure if it was out of fear or desire. It doesn't make sense. No, I guess it won't, not to you. Cash groaned and bent until he could rest his forehead on Lex's shoulder. It didn't look comfortable, but the gesture was so defeated it made Lex ache. Without thinking, he slid his hand up his back and cupped his neck. Cash made another sound and wrapped his arm around Lex's waist, pulling him from the wall and flesh against Cash instead. I've dreamed about seeing you again every day for the last 17 years. I've tried being with others, but none of them are you. The words washed over Lex, and while his mind told him it was insane, his soul thought it made perfect sense. Cash was his, had always been his. He couldn't explain it any other way, but there was too much history. We can't do this again. I'll be leaving in a few hours and I can't go through this again. Cash cupped his face and kissed him slow and deep. A moan escaped, and for a second Lex lost himself in the caress of his tongue, the feel of his lips, the sense of belonging. Then he yanked away. No, we can't do this. Cash's eyes gleamed yellow. Yellow? No one had yellow eyes. We can. The growly tone had Lex shivering. Cash, please. He wasn't sure what he was begging for. For Cash to save him? To take away the pain that would come. How would he be able to leave if Cash was kissing him? Chapter 5. Cash was shaking as he fought for control. His wolf urged him to mate with Lex before he could run away from them again. But Lex looked scared, wounded, and vulnerable, and Cash couldn't handle it. His Lex should be smiling. He wrapped his arms tighter around him. I'd never hurt you. You already have. You hurt me more than anyone else ever has. Cash flinched as if Lex had hit him. I never meant to hurt you. I searched for you. I needed you. My world fell apart and I needed you to come with me, but you didn't show. Lex pushed at him to be let free, but Cash tightened his hold. Instead, I wanted to come, Lex. I wanted to run away with you, but when I fought Dad, when I won, I took over his position in the pack. I can't leave. I have to stay in Warwood. And I have a life back in Cottleway. The pain. For a moment Cash believed he was having a heart attack, but it was only his mate rejecting him. He wouldn't die. He would live an empty, hollow life, but he wouldn't die. He wished he would die. The wine wouldn't be stopped. Tears burned his eyes, but he blinked fast not to let them spill over. Can I at least call you? The way Lex watched him made him want to hide. I guess. Cash nodded and stepped away. He couldn't. Lex was leaving. Was this how he'd felt when Cash hadn't shown at the gas station? He'd bear this pain. It would. Even the scales. I'll call Eric. It was as if he was watching himself from above when he went into the bedroom to make the call. He spoke, but he couldn't hear himself. What Eric said when he picked up, he didn't know, but it didn't take long before there was a knock on the door. Cash opened, and Eric gave him one look before the smile on his lips melted away and was replaced by worry. Are you okay? Lex wants to leave. Eric's eyes widened at the same time as Lex appeared behind Cash. Fuck. It was a low mutter, and Cash hoped it was too low for Lex to hear. But he wasn't sure. He always found it hard to judge with humans. When Eric followed it up with a louder, growlier fuck, Cash winced. No way. Lex could have missed it the second time. Yeah. Cash slumped his shoulders but fought to keep calm and not show any emotions. Samus chose that moment to tumble out of the woods, followed by Gordon in wolf form. Cash growled. Sorry. Samus held his eyes glued to the ground. Eric said to come help. Pull the car free. I tried telling Gordon to go away and not follow, but Gordon was more dominant and had ignored Samus. He didn't need to say the words out loud. Cash had had it with Gordon. The limit was reached before today, but now he wanted to beat the ever-living shit out of him. Gordon was forgetting his place. He might ignore Samus, but he did not trot up to Cash's house uninvited. As Alpha, Eric could go wherever he wanted, and Cash considered him a friend, maybe his only friend, so he didn't mind. Samus didn't normally come by, but he didn't mind Samus either. He was at the bottom of the pack, and it was the more dominant's job to take care of him. Cash feared they didn't always do a good job, and as one of the most dominant, maybe the most dominant, he'd gladly step up to the plate when it came to Samus, especially since he didn't think he'd ever have to discipline him. He didn't have any close friends since he never wanted to hurt a friend. He glanced over his shoulder at Lex. The only one he'd never have to hurt was his mate. No one would expect someone to harm their mate. Enforcer or not, it wasn't done. He could have had Lex and never have to fear having to harm him. But Lex wanted to leave. Gordon shifted into human form and Lex gasped. We're not allowing him to leave, are we? Gordon flashed sharp teeth in Lex's direction and Cash snarled. For a second, Gordon looked as if he'd realized his mistake. Then he straightened his back and looked at Eric. Never show what we are to humans. It's the rule. He's the enforcer. If he can't do the job, someone else should. Cash had an aha moment. Gordon didn't want to be Alpha, he wanted to be enforcer. It was a terrible idea. He took far too much pleasure in hurting people, and he had no sense of justice, but it came as such a shock that Cash was lost for words. Eric snarled, not a human sound, and a small sound escaped Lex. Cash wanted to look at him, but he didn't dare take his eyes off Gordon. He didn't trust Gordon. We're allowing him to leave, considering he didn't do anything wrong. Eric's voice was dripping with power, and Gordon reluctantly lowered his gaze. But it's not safe to have humans out there knowing about us. What if he gathers a bunch of hunters and comes after us? Because of a dented bumper? I think we're safe, Gordon. It was Samus speaking. His soft, low voice landed like a calming blanket over the rising tension. Right. Gordon, go home. It was an order, but Gordon didn't want to obey. Eric ignored him and turned to Samus. Let's pull the car free. They turned toward the woods and melted in between the trees. Gordon remained and Cash took a deep breath. If he didn't get a move on, Cash would jump him. Are we to follow them? Lex's voice wasn't more than a whisper. In a second. He didn't take his eyes off Gordon, who flashed teeth though. He couldn't look at Cash when he did it. He was both more submissive and in Cash's territory. Then he shifted into wolf and trotted off in the opposite direction of Eric and Samus. He was becoming a problem. Do you have your things? Cash glanced at Lex over his shoulder. Still unwilling to move. Most of it is in the car. My phone shattered, I have my wallet and keys in my jeans, and I have my overnight bag in the trunk. Will you be all right to drive? Maybe you should sleep a little more before you go. Or not go at all. Lex stared at him. Are you gonna ignore that there was a wolf who turned into a man in your garden? Cash pursed his lips. It's what we are. I understand if it's hard to take in. But you turn into a wolf? Hadn't he explained it already? Ah yes. And you could back when we were dating too? Oh yes. I was born a shifter. Every shifter is born, there is no being transformed by a bite thing as the fairy tales make it. This is all a dream. I'm dreaming, and I will wake up at home soon and everything will be back to normal. Cash's heart broke at the desperation in his voice. Do you want me to drive you? What? To Coddleway. I can drive, you can nap, and what? Cash needed to get back here. He had to live here. But it would give him a few more hours with Lex. No, I need to go. I need to. He sighed. I need to go home and hug Mr. M. He nodded as if it was the solution to all his problems. Cash nodded too. He couldn't force Lex to stay. Or he could, but Lex would hate him for it. He slumped his shoulders and stepped back into the cabin to get Lex's things. Lex had to go. He needed to get away from this craziness. There had been a Wolf who'd turned into a man, who'd turned back into a wolf again. And the man had given Lex the creeps. He had a good sense of people, or he'd always believed he was a good judge of character, and that man Lex did not want to meet him in a dark alley. There was something, evil was the wrong word, but ruthless and savage about him. He followed Cash through the woods, still dressed in his socks and sweats but wearing his wet sneakers. In his hand he had a plastic bag Cash had packed his jeans and socks in, and ahead he heard the two men wolves who'd gone before them talk. As they stepped out onto the road, the larger of the two looked Lex up and down. He wanted to shrink under his gaze, but there was no malice, only disapproval. "You're sure you want to leave?" Lex nodded, and Cash deflated in the corner of his eye. Lex did his best to ignore the ache spreading in his chest. He needed space. He wasn't meant to see Cash again. The smaller man made a sound, and Lex turned his attention to him. He shouldn't have. He looked as if he was about to cry, and it didn't help Lex's resolve at all. What the hell? They didn't know Lex. They wouldn't mourn his departure. Right. The larger man nodded and walked closer to Cash, only to engulf him in a hug. Part of Lex wanted to snarl at him to keep his hands to himself, but Cash allowed the hug, and Lex had no say in the matter. "I think the car is drivable." "I don't know anything about cars." The smaller of the two gave Lex a forced smile. "But it looks mostly unharmed." "Thank you." The man didn't reply but walked over to Cash and squeezed his arm. What the fuck was up with all the touching? Cash took a step in his direction as the others soundlessly melted into the woods. "I wrote my phone number on a note and put in the bag." Cash's gaze cut right through his defenses and into his soul. "Call me when you get there." Lex swallowed hard. "My phone is broken." He gestured at the car. "No landline." Lex shook his head. "Okay. Be safe." Cash turned to leave, and all the grief Lex had carried these last few days welled up again. "Cash." Before he could talk himself out of it, he flung himself at him. Cash caught him and Lex pulled him down for a kiss. He needed space, needed to think, but he needed Cash's lips on his. The groan escaping Cash set him on fire, and he tightened his hold. For an eternity they stood there, lips fused, tongues tangling and hands gripping. Then Lex pushed to be let free. The moment Cash let go of him, he walked to his car without uttering another word. He fumbled with the key but got the car started, and when he looked up, Cash was gone. A sound escaped him. It might have been a moan or it might have been a sob, he wasn't sure. He got the car rolling. The road was deserted, the darkness giving way for some light by the horizon. His hands shook. Had they pulled the car free by hand? They had. Lex hadn't seen a car or any tools, and if they had done it with muscle power alone they could have done it during the night. They'd been right there on the road in wolf form, hadn't they? He took a deep breath and focused on the road. Why did his chest hurt? He'd been without Cash for 17 years. Cash could turn into a wolf. Cash had lied to him, or maybe not lied, since Lex never asked him if he could turn into a wolf, but he'd withheld information from him. Had he ever known Cash? The voice in his head screamed yes. What the hell was he doing? As he increased the speed, he was aware he was making a mistake, but he had to leave. He couldn't deal with this. A black wolf appeared by the side of the road, and Lex knew it was Cash. For a second he slowed the car, then he forced his foot down on the gas pedal. Again. He was more focused on the wolf than the road, and right as he passed it, he raised his hand in a wave. A tear trickled down his cheek. Oh, for fuck's sake. Enough with the crying already. Lex had never been a crier, and these last 24 hours he'd done nothing but. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel and kept his gaze on the road. Everything would go back to normal. Once he got home, he'd get back to work. He'd find his routine. Chapter 6. 3 weeks later. December had arrived. Lex normally loved December. He draped his apartment in fairy lights, baked cookies, and bought gifts. Not many gifts, but he bought gifts for Mr. M and Nana, and usually he gave something to Jamie. This year Nana was gone. Mr. M didn't care much about gifts, and he'd gotten Jamie a present back in September that he'd kept in his wardrobe. It was already wrapped in everything. She was obsessed with Batgirl for some reason he couldn't understand, and he'd found an illustration. He'd most likely paid more than it was worth, but he'd thought of Jamie the moment he'd seen it. With a groan, he threw himself on the couch. He was empty. His life was empty. The first days after he'd come home, he'd been angry. Angry with Cash for walking into his life again, angry because there were werewolves and no one had told him, angry because he wanted to discuss the werewolves with Nana, and she wasn't there anymore. If there were werewolves, were there ghosts? Nana. He listened for several seconds. If she was around as a ghost, she wouldn't hang around his boring apartment. She'd sit by the counter in the gas station in Warwood and listen to the gossip. Elsie was the best source of gossip. A lump formed in his throat. Oh hell no, no more tears. He hoped she was there. He could picture her there. With a sigh, he grabbed his phone. He'd added Cash's number to his contacts, but he hadn't called or texted. Part of him felt guilty about it. He'd seen the pain in Cash, the desperation, but calling Cash would mean accepting they had something. It would mean accepting werewolves were real, and Cash might not have had a choice when he abandoned him all those years ago. With a growl, he scrolled to Cash's name and hit the call symbol. His heart thudded fast enough for Lex to fear it was coming loose. Cash speaking. The annoyed growl had Lex hesitating. Maybe it was a bad time? He almost hung up when Cash spoke again. Hello. He took a deep breath. Are there vampires too? Silence stretched for a second too long. Lex. No one had ever spoken his name on a purr before. It was too short to purr, and purr was the wrong word. Cash was a wolf, not a cat. It didn't stop a warm glow from building in Lex's chest. Yeah, 'cause I've been thinking. Lex. This time Cash sounded close to tears, which wasn't at all what Lex wanted. He didn't know what he wanted. He needed to hear Cash's voice. Once a couple of years ago, Jamie and I were called to a home. There was a young woman there and her throat was torn. I was sure someone had attacked her with a weapon of some kind. She bled out before we could get her to the hospital, and now I'm thinking, was it vampires? There was a rustle on the other end, as if Cash sat on his couch or crawled into his bed. His brain provided him with an image of his bed, and Lex did his best not to remember Cash's scent clinging to the pillows. Did you get home? Okay. Lex winced. Yes. Vampires, Cash. A vampire wouldn't waste blood. There are vampires? Shit. Why hadn't anyone told him? What if he'd run into a coven, or were covens for witches? Shit, were there witches? And get eaten? What if he'd already gotten eaten, but they'd erased his memory? Have I been eaten? It didn't take more than a second before Cash's chuckle drifted through the phone. I don't know, babe. Have you? What if they mind-controlled me? I think you're safe. But you're not sure. Lex smiled though. Damn, it was good to hear his voice. Maybe you should come up here so I can inspect you? Lex's cheeks heated. This is not the time to talk dirty to me, Cash. I'm having an existential crisis. Are you? Life as I've known it is fake. Are there witches? Cash sighed. It's not fake. You've lived a human life, same as most humans. But it's a lie. Did Nana know? What if she'd known and never told him? Shouldn't hurt, but it did. Maybe. Most of the elderly in Warwood respect the old tales. Lex nodded, despite Cash not seeing him. There were a lot of tales about wolves in Warwood, none about vampires or witches though. Witches? I have no idea. I've never heard of any witches other than Wiccans. Lex frowned at the ceiling. Nan's attorney has been calling me. Oh, what did they say? Lex grimaced. I haven't picked up. Lex. I don't want to fight with Dad, and he sighed. What if she'd left him the house? What would he do then? You need to talk to them. Maybe they'll tell you Kenneth inherits it all. Yeah, but see, it would piss me off. I don't want the house, I don't think. But I don't want him to have it. She was so angry with him, and he never did anything for her. Had I had a mother, I'd have cherished her. Cash hummed. This conversation didn't go the way Lex had planned. He hadn't had much of a plan, but talking about his problems hadn't been his goal. He regretted leaving. Cash. Maybe he couldn't live in Warwood, but he'd run. Panicked. I think you should call them. Hear what they have to say or visit them. I can come with you. Thank you, but you don't need to. It's my problem. Lex? I'll do anything for you, you know that, right? Lex shook his head. How could he know? Babe, come home. I'll help you sort it. Home. He was home, sort of. Cotaway wasn't what he pictured when he thought of home, but it was where his job was, and he liked his job a lot. There would be no ambulances in the woods outside of Warwood. Do you eat cats? Cash snorted. No, we don't eat cats. Eric gave Cash a wide-eyed look and shook his head as he heard Lex's question. About the cats. He'd come by to talk about what to do about Gordon. He'd been trying to persuade some of the pack members to vote for him to become enforcer. As if they lived in a fucking democracy. Had it been anyone else on the line, Cash would have ended the call, but instead he'd walked away from the kitchen and sat on the couch in the living room. I don't think Mr. M would enjoy Warwood. If anything, Eric's eyes widened more. Then he made a call me sign and moved soundlessly toward the door. Cash nodded a thanks as he looked back at him. Before exiting, the last 3 weeks had been the worst of his life. Gordon was becoming an increasing problem, and Lex hadn't been in touch. He'd been growling and snarling at everyone, Eric included. You think a cat prefers the city to the countryside? Cash didn't care what Lex replied. He only wanted to hear his voice. Mr. M is a lazy tabby with a food problem. Food problem. So many cat owners were insane, dressed their cats in bow ties and fed them cake instead of food fit for cats, but he'd never taken Lex for a lunatic. Could he handle bow ties on an animal? Yeah, he likes eating more than he likes moving. Cash chuckled. It might change if you let him explore the woods. Maybe, but he'd get lost. He's never been in a forest. Shaking his head, Cash rubbed his chest. He wanted Lex here with or without his cat. I don't know if I can face Warwood, Cash. They're all looking at me. Cash took a careful breath. Snarl at them. It wouldn't be as impressive as if you did it. He ended the sentence with a chuckle, but warmth spread in Cash's chest. If Lex needed him to snarl at people, he would snarl at people. It'd be my pleasure to snarl at them for you. I've managed on my own for 17 years. But now he didn't need to. Cash could take care of him. And how many EMTs do you have in Warwood? None. Fuck. The pack needs you. We have a lot of injuries. Wolves. I'm not a vet. For a second Cash was insulted. Then he shook his head. We're injured in human form too. I'm still not. I mean, a guy changed shape, but I'm still trying to convince myself it didn't happen. Cash frowned. Why? Because it shouldn't be possible. If there are wolves, are there squirrel shifters? Cash grinned. I don't know. I've never heard of one. Are there vampires? Yes. I told you. Are there witches? I already told you, I don't think so. Are there demons? Cash rubbed his forehead. It would have been better to have this conversation in person, but Lex was 7 hours away. Not somewhere he could pop over for a coffee and a kiss. I think demons were made up around the same time as religion. No demons. No. Though could he say for sure? He didn't know everything that was out there. He'd lived all his life in Warwood, a sheltered life in the pack near a small village of humans. Ghosts. My gut tells me no. So, Nana isn't sitting in the gas station listening to Elsie gossiping? There was longing in his voice, and Cash wished he could say yes. I don't know, babe. But you've never talked to a ghost? He smiled at the wall next to the TV. No, I haven't. Okay. I've got to go. Cash's initial reaction was to object, but Lex had called. If he'd done it once, he might do it again, and now Cash had his number. He was sure he could have found it if he'd searched, but he'd begged Lex to let him know he got back okay, and he hadn't. Work? No, I've already been. And it went okay? Cash realized the importance of an EMT, but he was worried something would happen to Lex. He might fear vampires, but Cash feared humans. Desperate humans with guns. If he was called to places where people had been shot, beaten, attacked, and so on, there was a risk they'd do the same to Lex. As they had the victim, and Lex was only human. Cash wanted to bubble wrap him, and then put a bulletproof vest over the bubble wrap, and make him wear a hard hat. Yeah, nothing dramatic. Good. He took a slow breath. You're careful, right? Careful. Lex sounded confused. So you're not hurt? If I'm hurt, Jamie is right there. It's the best thing about arriving with the ambulance. Lex. He put as much warning into the word as he dared to. Yes, I'm careful, Cash. I can take care of myself. All right. Damn. I need to go now. Okay. I loved hearing your voice. Sappy. He winced. Silence stretched. Yeah, have a good night, Cash. The call ended before He could say anything else. With a groan he got up from the couch, grabbed a glass of water and called